Nothing prepares you for seeing your hero become helpless. When Astrid walked into her childhood home after 20 years, she found her once mighty father sitting alone in the shadows, forgotten by the very people he had protected with his life. The great chieftain Erik, who had taught her to fight and never surrender, now struggled to remember her face. Astrid had returned to their village with 2 orphaned twin girls, seeking shelter from the harsh winter. But the place she remembered as strong and proud had grown cold in more ways than one. The villagers who once cheered her father's name now avoided his house. As old secrets began to surface about her family's past, Astrid realized she would have to learn something no warrior training had ever taught her. What truth about her father would change everything she thought she knew about strength? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of snow and old memories as Astrid pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, the twin girls huddled close together on the wooden sledge, their small faces pale with cold and uncertainty. Sigrid clutched a carved wooden doll, while Solveig kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if expecting danger to emerge from the white landscape at any moment. 20 years. 20 years since Astrid had last seen these familiar fjords, the way the mountains carved dark silhouettes against the winter sky, the way smoke rose from the longhouse chimneys in thin grey ribbons. She had been barely more than a girl then, eager to prove herself worthy of the warrior's path. Now, at 42, her hands bore the calluses of countless sword grips, and her shoulders carried the weight of battles won and comrades lost. The village of Ironhold nestled in the curve of the fjord like a sleeping beast. From this distance, it looked unchanged. The same timber and stone structures, the same arrangement of houses around the central meeting hall. But as they drew closer, Astrid noticed the subtle signs of decline. Several roofs needed rethatching, and the carved dragon heads that once adorned the buildings had weathered to grey anonymity. The place felt smaller somehow, as if the very act of her leaving had diminished it. "Is that where we'll live?" Sigrid asked, her voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath the sledge runners. Astrid looked down at the child 8 years old, with the kind of serious expression that belonged on someone who had seen too much too young. "For now," she said, then softened her tone. "It's where my family comes from, where I learned to be strong." Solveig, Sigrid's twin but possessed of a fiercer spirit, lifted her chin. "We're already strong." "Yes," Astrid agreed, impressed by the girl's defiance. "But there are different kinds of strength. Some you learn with a sword, some you learn with your heart." The twins had come to her 3 months ago, during what should have been a simple coastal raid. Their fishing village had already been burned, their parents already dead, when Astrid's warband arrived, expecting easy plunder. Instead, they found 2 children defending their parents' bodies with kitchen knives, refusing to run, even when faced with armed warriors. Something in their desperate courage had pierced through Astrid's hardened exterior. She had claimed them as her own responsibility, much to the confusion of her fellow raiders. Now, as they approached the village gates, Astrid wondered if she had made the right choice. She had money saved from years of successful campaigns, enough to provide for the girls, but money could not buy acceptance. And acceptance, she was beginning to understand, might be more complicated than she had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the village gates. Old Bjorn, who had once greeted every visitor with boisterous warmth, barely looked up from mending his fishing nets. His weathered face remained carefully neutral as he nodded toward the main path. "Astrid Eriksdottir," he said, using her formal name instead of the familiar nickname he had called her as a child. "Been a long time." "Too long," she replied, searching his expression for some hint of the affection she remembered. "How goes the winter, Bjorn?" "Hard as always." His gaze flicked to the twins, then away. "Your father's house still stands. Can't say much more than that." The dismissive tone hit her like a physical blow. This man had taught her to tie knots, had lifted her onto his shoulders during harvest festivals, had wept openly when she left to seek her fortune as a shield maiden. Now he spoke to her like a stranger, and an unwelcome one at that. They continued through the village streets, and everywhere Astrid saw the same pattern. Faces turned away, conversations stopped. Mid-sentence, children were quickly called inside. The few people who acknowledged her presence did so with stiff formality, as if she were a dangerous animal that might be safely observed from a distance. "Why don't they like you?" Sigrid whispered. Astrid had been wondering the same thing. When she left, she had been the village's pride, the daughter of their beloved chieftain, destined for glory in far-off battles. She had expected to return as a hero, with tales of distant shores and hard-won victories. Instead, she felt like an intruder in her own birthplace. Erik's longhouse sat at the village's heart, where it had always been, but even here, the signs of neglect were evident. The carved wooden posts that supported the roof had lost their bright paint, and one of the great doors hung slightly askew on its iron hinges. Smoke rose from the central fire pit at least, which meant her father still lived. As they approached, Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. The man inside was the foundation of her childhood, the hero who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be strong, honorable, worthy of respect. She had built her entire sense of self around the idea of making him proud, of proving herself worthy to carry his name into battle. She pushed open the door and stepped into the familiar warmth of the longhouse. The interior looked much as she remembered: heavy wooden tables, carved chairs covered with worn furs, weapons mounted on the walls like sleeping guardians. But the air felt different, heavy with the scent of unwashed clothing and neglect. Erik sat in his high chair near the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the warmth. Astrid's breath caught in her throat. This shrunken figure bore little resemblance to the towering warrior who had dominated her memories. His once golden hair had gone white and thin, his broad shoulders curved forward as if bearing an invisible weight. When he looked up at the sound of their entrance, his blue eyes held a cloudy confusion that made Astrid's chest ache. "Father?" she said softly, approaching the chair as she might approach a wounded animal. Erik studied her face for a long moment, and she saw the struggle there, the mind trying to grasp something that kept slipping away like water through fingers. "Astrid?" The name came out like a question, uncertain and fragile. "Yes, father, I've come home." Relief flooded his features, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice carrying none of its old authority. "There's nothing here for you now." Behind her, the twins stood silent and wide-eyed, taking in this reunion that was nothing like the joyful homecoming Astrid had imagined during the long journey north. She knelt beside her father's chair, noting how his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the blanket. "These are Sigrid and Solveig," she said, gesturing to the girls. "I'm caring for them now. We need a place to stay through the winter." Erik's gaze moved to the twins, and for a moment, something of his old gentleness emerged. "Children," he murmured. "Been too long since children lived in this house." Sigrid stepped forward with the directness that Astrid was learning to expect from her. "Are you really a famous warrior?" she asked. Erik's laugh was bitter. "Was, child, was. Now I'm just an old man who can't remember where he put his boots." "I could help you find them," Sigrid offered seriously. This time, Erik's smile was genuine. "I'd like that." As Astrid helped her father to his feet and began the process of settling the twins into their new temporary home, she pushed aside her growing unease about the village's cold reception. Whatever had changed here could be dealt with later. For now, she had her family to care for, both the father who had raised her and the children who needed her protection. But as she unpacked their few belongings in the room where she had slept as a child, Astrid caught sight of something that made her pause. There, half hidden behind a wooden chest, hung a tattered war banner, her father's battle standard from his days as a chieftain. The fabric was faded and moth-eaten, the once proud golden wolf barely visible against the dark blue field. The sight of it sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the shutters. This banner had once flown over victories that brought honor to their family name. Now it hung like a funeral shroud, forgotten in a corner where even the mice avoided it. Something was wrong here, something beyond her father's failing health and the village's unexpected coldness. As she tucked the twins into their sleeping furs and listened to Erik's uneven breathing from his chair by the fire, Astrid made herself a promise. Before the winter ended, she would find out what had happened to turn her homecoming into this strange, hollow reunion. She would discover why the people who once loved her family now treated them like strangers. And she would learn what truth lay hidden beneath 20 years of separation and silence. The wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves like a restless spirit. In the dancing shadows cast by the firelight, the old war banner seemed to move, as if trying to tell her something important, something she was not yet ready to hear. The first week passed in a careful dance of adjustment. Astrid focused on settling the twins into routines that might help them feel secure morning chores, afternoon lessons with wooden practice swords, evening stories by the fire. Erik seemed to gain strength from their presence, his confusion lifting during the hours when small voices filled the longhouse with questions and laughter. But outside their walls, the village's coldness persisted like frost that never quite melted. It came to a head on the 8th morning, when Astrid ventured to the market square with the twins. She needed supplies, winter clothing for the girls, dried meat, grain for porridge. Simple transactions that should have been accomplished with neighborly efficiency. Instead, she found herself standing before merchant stalls, where vendors suddenly developed urgent business elsewhere when she approached. The few who would deal with her charged prices that made her jaw clench, quoting costs that were easily double what she remembered from her youth. 15 silver pieces for a child's cloak? She asked Ingvar the weaver, a man whose family had been friends with hers for generations. Ingvar wouldn't meet her eyes. Quality wool isn't cheap. Take it or leave it. Behind her, she could hear other customers being quoted much more reasonable prices for similar goods. The message was clear. She and her charges were not welcome here. The twins sensed the tension, moving closer to her sides like young wolves seeking pack protection. Sigrid's hand found hers, small fingers cold despite her mittens. "Maybe we should go home," Solveig whispered. Astrid was about to agree when a group of village children approached. She recognized a few faces, sons and daughters of people she had grown up with. They should have been friendly, curious about the newcomers. Instead, they formed a loose circle around the twins, with the predatory calculation that children sometimes displayed toward those they perceived as different. "Are these the orphan girls?" asked a boy of perhaps 10 years, his voice carrying the kind of cruelty that adults often dismissed as childhood honesty. "The ones whose parents got themselves killed?" Sigrid stepped protectively in front of her sister, but Astrid could see the hurt in both girls' faces. "Their names are Sigrid and Solveig," Astrid said firmly, "and they're under my protection, just like you protected your own family." The question came from an older girl, maybe 12, with the confident malice that suggested she was repeating something she had heard adults say. The words hit Astrid like a physical blow. "What did you say?" But the children were already scattering, their leader's bold cruelty apparently exhausted now that they faced an adult's direct attention. Astrid stood in the market square, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and confusion, while the twins looked up at her with questions she could not answer. They walked home in silence, their shopping mission abandoned. But the encounter had shattered something, the illusion that whatever was wrong with her homecoming was merely a matter of time and patience. That afternoon, while the twins helped Erik sort through old fishing tackle, Astrid decided to seek answers. She walked to the forge where Magnus Ironhand worked, a man who had been her father's closest friend and most trusted advisor. If anyone would give her honest answers, it would be Magnus. She found him hammering out horseshoe nails, his massive frame bent over the anvil in concentration. When he saw her approach, his rhythm faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady beat. "Magnus," she said, waiting until he finished the piece and set down his hammer. He turned to face her, and she was shocked by how much he had aged. The bear of a man she remembered had become gaunt, his black beard now streaked with silver, but his eyes were still sharp, still kind. "Astrid," he said simply, "heard you were back. What happened here, Magnus? Why does everyone treat my father, treat us like we carry some kind of plague?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals of his forge. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "Some secrets are better left buried, girl." "What secrets? I have a right to know." "Do you?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in the sword at her hip, the confidence in her stance, the way she carried herself like someone accustomed to command. "You've been gone 20 years, Astrid. 20 years of making your own choices, your own life. Maybe that's worth more than the answers you think you want." The evasion made her angry. "Those children today, they said something about me not protecting my family. What did they mean?" Magnus's expression darkened. "Children repeat what they hear. Doesn't mean they understand it. Then help me understand it." He turned away from her, began organizing tools that didn't need organizing. "Go home, Astrid. Care for your father and those girls. Let the past stay where it belongs." But as she walked away from the forge, frustrated and more confused than ever, Astrid caught sight of something that made her stop short. There, half hidden under a pile of waste metal, was a piece of burned parchment. The edges were charred, most of the writing illegible, but she could make out a few words: "Blood price," and what looked like her father's name. She glanced back at Magnus, who was pointedly ignoring her, then quickly retrieved the fragment and tucked it into her cloak. That evening, after the twins had gone to sleep and Erik dozed in his chair by the fire, Astrid studied the burned letter by candlelight. Most of the text was gone, but she could piece together fragments: accusations, demands for justice, references to the night of blood and innocent families. When she looked up, she found Erik watching her with an expression of such profound sadness that her breath caught. "You found it," he said, his voice clearer than it had been in days. "Found what, father?" "The letter. I tried to burn it, but the wind kept blowing pieces back into the house, like it wanted me to remember." Astrid moved to kneel beside his chair. "What letter? What does this mean?" Erik's hands shook as he reached out to touch the burned fragment. "It means that some mistakes are too big to ever make right. It means that coming home wasn't safe for you, but I was too weak to send you away. I don't understand. The village, they have good reason to hate our family name, good reason to want us gone." His eyes, suddenly lucid and filled with anguish, met hers. "They'll never forgive us for what I did, and maybe they shouldn't." Before Astrid could press for more details, Erik's moment of clarity seemed to pass. His eyes grew confused again, and he pulled the blanket closer around his shoulders. "So cold," he murmured. "Why is it always so cold now?" Astrid sat back on her heels, the burned letter fragment in her hands, her mind racing. Whatever her father had done, whatever crime or mistake had turned their family name into something the village wanted to forget, it was serious enough to poison her homecoming 20 years later. The next morning brought their first direct confrontation. Astrid was drawing water from the communal well when Thorvald Beastbreaker approached. She remembered him as a young man, ambitious and hot-tempered, always eager to prove himself in competition with others. Now he carried the authority of a village leader, his fine cloak and silver arm rings, marking his elevated status. "Astrid Eriksdottir," he said, using her formal name with deliberate coldness. "We need to talk." She straightened, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her sword hilt. "What about? About how long you plan to stay here, about whether you understand that some people aren't welcome anymore." This is my family's home. My father built half this village. Your father destroyed half this village." Thorvald's voice carried a bitter edge that made several other villagers stop to listen. "And if you're truly his daughter, you'll take those orphans and leave before old wounds start bleeding again." Astrid felt her temper flare. "Speak plainly, Thorvald. If you have accusations to make them." But Thorvald was already walking away, having delivered his warning for all to hear. 3 days, he called back over his shoulder. "Find somewhere else to spend the winter." As Astrid carried the water bucket back to the longhouse, she was aware of eyes watching from every doorway, faces peering through shuttered windows. The village had drawn its battle lines, and somehow she and her family were on the wrong side. That night, Erik suffered what seemed like a collapse brought on by stress. His breathing became labored, his confusion deeper than ever, and Astrid found herself torn between seeking medical help and protecting him from whatever truth the villagers were so determined to make him face. As she sat beside his bed, listening to his uneven breathing and watching the twins sleep peacefully nearby, Astrid made a decision. She would find out what really happened. She would piece together the truth behind the burned letter, the village's hatred, and her father's guilt. But first, she would make it clear that threats against her family would not be tolerated. Whatever Erik had done, whatever crimes lay in the past, she was here now, and she had not spent 20 years learning to fight just to surrender without understanding what she was surrendering to. The morning after Thorvald's ultimatum, Astrid began her search in earnest. While the twins helped Erik with simple tasks that seemed to soothe his agitation, she systematically explored every corner of the longhouse she had once called home. Her childhood memories painted this place as a sanctuary of warmth and safety, where her mother's laughter had mixed with her father's booming voice and the crackling of the eternal fire. Now, seeing it through adult eyes clouded by suspicion, she noticed details that had escaped her before, scratches on the wooden walls that might have been made by weapons, dark stains on the floor, stones that no amount of scrubbing had completely removed. In what had once been her parents' private chamber, she found Erik's old sea chest pushed far back under the sleeping platform. The heavy wooden box was secured with an iron lock that had long since rusted into uselessness. With some effort, she pried it open. The contents made her hands tremble. Wrapped in oiled leather were weapons she didn't recognize. A ceremonial axe with intricate silver inlays, several daggers with dried blood still crusted on their blades, and a collection of gold arm rings that bore the craftsmanship of different tribes. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the weapons and treasure, lay a bundle of documents that made her stomach lurch. Letters demanding justice for murdered families, a list of names, many crossed out in what looked suspiciously like blood. Maps showing attack routes against settlements that were supposed to be under Ironhold's protection. And most damning of all, a detailed record, in her father's own hand, a meticulous accounting of raids that had gone far beyond the traditional boundaries of honorable warfare. As she read, the careful script revealed a systematic campaign of violence against innocent fishing villages, farming settlements, even trading posts that had paid tribute for protection. The date spanned several months 20 years ago, right around the time when her mother had disappeared and she herself had left to seek her fortune. One entry made her blood run cold. Raven Shallow Settlement, 47 souls taken, including children. Resistance minimal. Good silver acquired, but Thora continues to argue against expansion of operations. Her softness becomes liability. Thora, her mother's name. Astrid sank back on her heels, the implications washing over her like an icy tide. These weren't the actions of a desperate chieftain protecting his people during hard times. They were the calculated crimes of someone who had chosen profit over honor, someone who had turned warfare into murder for personal gain. Mother tried to stop him, she whispered to the empty room. The next entry confirmed her worst fears. Thora threatened to warn. Ravens hollow before tomorrow's action. Cannot allow her interference to continue. Hard choices must be made for the good of all. She found herself remembering her mother's final weeks with new clarity. Thora had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours walking alone along the fjord shores. Astrid had attributed it to the normal rhythms of adult concerns, but now she saw it differently. Her mother had been wrestling with impossible choices, loyalty to her husband versus protection of innocent people. A soft footstep made her look up. Sigrid stood in the doorway, her young face creased with concern. "Astrid, you look sad." Quickly, Astrid closed the chest and moved to embrace the child. "I'm all right, little one, just remembering things from long ago." "Bad things?" The question was asked with the directness that both twins possessed, a quality Astrid was learning to respect even when it made her uncomfortable. These girls had seen enough of the world to know that adults carried burdens children couldn't understand. "Sometimes we learn things about people we love that are difficult to accept," Astrid said carefully. "But that doesn't mean we stop loving them." Sigrid nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Like how we still love our mama and papa, even though they couldn't protect us?" The simple wisdom of it hit Astrid like a physical blow. Yes, exactly like that. That afternoon, while Erik napped and the twins played a quiet game with carved wooden figures, Astrid sought out Magnus again. This time, she brought one of the documents from the chest. Not the most damning evidence, but enough to make her point. She found him in his workshop, repairing a broken sword blade. When she placed the parchment before him, his hands stilled on his work. "Where did you find this?" he asked without looking up. "In my father's chest, along with enough evidence to hang him twice over, if he was still the man who wrote these orders." Magnus set down his hammer and finally met her eyes. "What do you want me to say, Astrid? That your father was a saint? That the village's hatred is misplaced? I want you to tell me what happened to my mother." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of village life and the soft whisper of wind through the forge chimney. When Magnus finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old grief. "Thora came to me the night before the Ravenshollow raid. She was desperate, wild with fear about what Erik planned to do. She begged me to help her warn them, to find some way to stop the massacre." "And did you?" "I tried. God help me, I tried." But Erik had become something different by then, obsessed with accumulating wealth, convinced that only strength and fear could secure our future. When Thora threatened to ride ahead and warn the settlement, Magnus's voice broke. "He what?" "He accused her of treason, said she was choosing strangers over her own family, her own village. The argument got heated, and she struck him across the face, called him a monster who dishonored everything their marriage had meant." Astrid could picture it all too clearly, her gentle mother, driven to fury by the realization that the man she loved had become someone she could no longer recognize. "That was the last time anyone saw her alive," Magnus continued. "Erik claimed she had run away, rather than face the shame of his necessary actions. Most people believed him, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. But you didn't believe him." Magnus's laugh was bitter. "I helped build the pyre where he burned her bloodied cloak. He said wolves had taken her while she wandered in her madness. But Thora knew these mountains better than any wolf pack. She wouldn't have died so carelessly." The truth settled over Astrid like a shroud. Her father hadn't just ordered the massacre of innocent families, he had murdered her mother to prevent her from stopping him. The hero of her childhood memories was revealed as a man who had chosen wealth over honor, violence over protection, and ultimately his wife's death over his own accountability. "Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you accuse him directly? With what proof? With what authority?" Erik was chieftain, beloved by most of the village for his past victories. "I was just a blacksmith with suspicions and grief." Magnus resumed his hammering, each strike harder than the last. "Besides, the raids stopped after Thora's death. Erik seemed to lose his appetite for conquest. Maybe guilt finally caught up with him." As Astrid walked home through the village streets, she found herself seeing everything differently. The cold treatment wasn't just about old crimes, it was about a community that had been forced to live with the knowledge that their protector had become their shame. They had watched their neighbors suffer for Erik's greed and had done nothing to stop it. Now she understood the weight of inherited guilt, the way past sins could poison present relationships across generations. The twins, walking beside her with their innocent chatter about the day's small adventures, had no idea they were living under the shadow of crimes committed before their birth. That evening, as she tucked the girls into their sleeping furs, Astrid made a silent promise. Whatever else came from her discoveries, she would find a way to protect these children from the darkness that had consumed her family. They deserved better than to inherit the consequences of Erik's choices. But first, she had to decide what to do with the truth she had uncovered. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery that changed everything Astrid thought she knew about her mother's final days. While cleaning out a storage alcove to make more room for the twins' belongings, her fingers found something wedged deep between two roof beams, a small object wrapped in rotting cloth. When she unwrapped it carefully, her breath caught. It was a rune stone, no larger than her palm, carved from pale granite and inscribed with protective runes in her mother's delicate hand. But these weren't the usual blessings for safe travels or good harvests. These were desperate prayers for the power to prevent bloodshed, to turn hearts away from violence, to protect the innocent from those who would harm them. Along the stone's edge, barely visible in the morning light, were words that made Astrid's hands shake. For the children of Ravenshollow, who deserved to see another dawn. Her mother had known, not just about Erik's plans, but about the specific target, the families who would die if she couldn't find a way to stop the raid. This wasn't a general opposition to warfare, it was a desperate attempt to save particular lives, particular children who would die because of her husband's greed. "What's that?" Solveig appeared at her elbow with the silent approach both twins had mastered during their months of hiding and survival. "Something that belonged to my mother," Astrid said, closing her fingers around the stone. "Something that shows she was trying to help people." Solveig studied her face with the unsettling perception that trauma sometimes gave to children. Was she like us? Did someone try to hurt people she loved? The question was so astute that Astrid felt her throat tighten. "Yes, little one, exactly like that." That afternoon, while Erik dozed and the twins helped each other practice reading from an old collection of sagas, Astrid decided to seek out Helga the Wise, the village's oldest resident and keeper of its collective memory. If anyone knew the full truth about the events 20 years ago, it would be the ancient woman who had served as advisor to 3 generations of chieftains. She found Helga in her small cottage at the village's edge, surrounded by the dried herbs and carved talismans that marked her as both healer and seer. The old woman's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, fixed on Astrid with unsettling intensity. "Astrid, Erik's daughter," Helga said before Astrid could announce herself. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" "Sit." Helga gestured to a low stool beside her fire. "The past has been stirring since you returned. Old ghosts are restless. Old secrets want to be told." Astrid showed her the runestone, and Helga's expression grew grave as she traced the carved symbols with one gnarled finger. "Your mother came to me the night before she disappeared," the old woman said. Desperate, half mad with fear and shame. She had discovered the full scope of what Erik planned, not just the raid on Ravenshollow, but a whole campaign of attacks against settlements under our protection. "What did you tell her?" "I told her what she already knew, that some choices define us forever, and that living with the consequences of inaction can be worse than dying for action." Helga's voice carried the weight of someone who had watched too many such moments unfold. "I helped her carve this stone, but I warned her that rune magic couldn't change a heart already set on violence. So she went anyway. She tried to ride out before dawn to warn Ravenshollow. Erik caught her at the village gates. They argued there in the early light, where half the settlement could hear them screaming accusations at each other. Helga poked at the fire with her iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. That was the last time anyone saw Thora alive. What did people think happened? Most believed Erik's story that grief and shame had driven her to madness, that she wandered into the wilderness and was taken by wolves. It was easier than believing their chieftain had murdered his own wife to protect his plans for murder. Astrid felt something cold settle in her stomach. But you didn't believe it. I found her horse the next day, grazing peacefully in a meadow half a mile from the village. No wolves had touched it, no signs of struggle. A mad woman fleeing into the wilderness doesn't carefully unsaddle her horse and set it free to graze. The implications were clear, but Astrid needed to hear them spoken aloud. You think my father killed her? I think your father made a choice that morning between his wife and his ambitions, and that Thora paid the price for his decision. Helga's eyes met Astrid's directly. But I also think the guilt of it destroyed something essential in him. The raids stopped after her death. Erik became a different man, withdrawn, haunted, gradually losing his grip on leadership and eventually on reality itself. As Astrid walked home through the village streets and her mother's runestone warm in her palm, she found herself seeing her father's decline through new eyes. She had attributed his failing memory and confusion to simple age, but what if it was something more complex? What if 20 years of carrying the secret of her mother's murder had slowly eaten away at his sanity? That evening, she watched Erik interact with the twins during their usual routine of shared meals and fireside stories. He was gentle with them, patient in a way she didn't remember from her own childhood, as if their innocence provided some kind of refuge from his own darkness. Tell us about the great battles, Sigrid requested, as she did every night. But instead of the usual tales of glorious victories, Erik surprised them all by speaking of something different. The greatest battle isn't always the one fought with swords, he said, his voice carrying an unusual clarity. Sometimes the greatest battle is the one fought in your own heart, between what you want and what you know is right. Did you ever fight that kind of battle? Solveig asked. Erik was quiet for so long that Astrid thought he had drifted back into confusion. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. Yes, child. And I lost. Later that night, after the twins were asleep and Erik had retired to his chamber, Astrid sat alone by the dying fire and tried to reconcile the man she had discovered with the father she had loved. The evidence was overwhelming. Erik had committed terrible crimes, had murdered his own wife to protect his ability to commit more crimes, had brought shame and suffering to their family name. But she had also seen his gentleness with the twins, his obvious love for her despite his confusion, his apparent regret for choices that had cost him everything that truly mattered. Could a person be both monster and loving father? Could someone who had done unforgivable things still deserve forgiveness from those he had wronged? As the fire burned down to embers, Astrid found herself thinking about the twins, how they spoke with matter-of-fact acceptance about their parents' deaths, how they had chosen to trust her despite having every reason to fear adults who made promises they couldn't keep. Maybe the question wasn't whether Erik deserved forgiveness. Maybe the question was whether she could find a way to break the cycle of violence and guilt that had poisoned her family for 20 years and give Sigrid and Solveig something better than the legacy of shame she had inherited. The confrontation Astrid had been dreading came 3 days later, when she ventured to the village well and found herself face to face with Ragnar Sorrowborn, whose name now carried terrible new meaning. Ragnar had been a young mother 20 years ago, with 3 small children and a husband who fished the coastal waters. Now she was a grey-haired woman whose eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from losing everything that matters. "I know who you are," Ragnar said without preamble, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had moved beyond anger into something colder. "You're Erik the betrayer's daughter." You have his eyes. Astrid set down her water bucket carefully, aware that several other villagers had stopped their morning routines to watch this encounter. I'm Astrid, Erik's daughter. And you're right, I do have his eyes. Do you also have his taste for murdering children? The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Astrid forced herself to remain calm. I don't know what you mean. Ragnar's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Of course you don't. You were safely away, earning your reputation as a warrior, while your father was butchering fishing families for sport. My husband, my 3 babies, all dead, because Erik decided their lives were worth less than the silver in their boats. Around them, other villagers had gathered, forming a loose circle that felt increasingly hostile. Astrid recognized some faces from her childhood, but the warmth she remembered had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous. I didn't know, Astrid said quietly. I was 19 when I left. I thought he was still the honorable man who raised me. Honorable? The word seemed to strike Ragnar like a physical insult. Your father led raids against settlements that had paid tribute for protection. He killed my youngest boy with his own hands. Little Olav was only 4 years old, tried to hide behind a fishing net. Erik split his skull with that ceremonial axe he was so proud of. The image Ragnar painted was so vivid, so specific, that Astrid felt her stomach lurch. She thought of the bloodied axe she had found in Erik's chest, the one with silver inlays that had once been his pride. Now she understood why the blood had never been fully cleaned away. My daughter Freydis was 7, Ragnar continued, her voice growing stronger as more villagers gathered to witness this confrontation. She could weave better than most adults, had a voice like a skylark when she sang. Erik's men dragged her from our burning house and cut her throat because she wouldn't stop crying for her mother. Each detail was a knife thrust, precisely aimed to inflict maximum pain. But Astrid sensed something beneath. Ragnar's cruelty, not just grief and anger, but a desperate need to make someone, anyone, acknowledge what had been lost. I'm sorry, Astrid said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. I'm sorry for your losses, for the pain my family caused you. Sorry? Ragnar stepped closer, her voice rising to carry across the market square. You think sorry matters? You think an apology brings back my babies, my husband, my life? No, Astrid replied honestly. I don't think it brings back anything, but I needed to say it anyway. The honesty seemed to catch Ragnar off guard. She had clearly expected defensiveness, denials, perhaps even threats. Instead, she found herself facing someone who wasn't trying to minimize or excuse the terrible truths she had spoken. We want you gone, called out another voice from the crowd, Bjorn Notbeard, whose own family had lost cousins in the raids. We want all of Erik's blood gone from this place. You bring nothing but bad memories and worse, luck. Astrid turned to face the growing crowd, her hand resting instinctively on her sword hilt, not as a threat, but as a source of comfort in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. I understand your anger, she said, raising her voice to address the entire gathering. I understand why you want us gone, but I need you to understand something too I didn't know. For 20 years, I believed my father was a hero. I built my life around trying to be worthy of his example. And now, Ragnar demanded. Astrid took a deep breath, aware that her next words would shape everything that followed. Now I know better. Now I know that the man I thought was my father was partly a lie, and that the real Erik Ironhold brought shame and suffering to families who trusted him. The crowd stirred restlessly, unsure how to respond to this admission. They had expected her to defend Erik's actions or claim ignorance of his crimes. They hadn't expected her to acknowledge the full weight of what he had done. But I also know, Astrid continued, that I have 2 orphaned girls in my care who need shelter and protection. They didn't choose to be connected to my family's shame, any more than your children chose to be victims of my father's crimes. Their parents probably died the same way mine did, called out a young man whose scarred hands suggested he had survived one of the good raids. Killed by raiders who cared more about profit than honor. Yes, Astrid agreed, surprising him with her directness. Their parents were killed by raiders. That's exactly why they need protection now, why they need adults who will choose differently than the ones who failed them before. She looked around the circle of faces, seeing the mix of anger, grief, and uncertainty that her words had provoked. I can't undo what my father did. I can't bring back your families or erase the shame he brought to our name. But I can promise you this, I won't run from the truth of what he was, and I won't let his crimes define what I become. Pretty words, Ragnar said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. But words don't restore honor or heal wounds. No, Astrid agreed, they don't, but they're a beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, still muttering among themselves, but lacking the unified anger that might have turned to violence, Astrid retrieved her water bucket and began the walk home. Behind her, she could hear Ragnar speaking to the other survivors, her voice carrying a note of confusion that hadn't been there before. When she reached the longhouse, she found Erik sitting by the fire with the twins on either side of him, teaching them to carve simple patterns in pieces of soft wood. The scene looked peaceful, domestic, nothing like the image of a man who had once murdered children with his own hands. But as she watched, Astrid noticed something that made her breath catch. Erik's hands, usually so unsteady now, were perfectly controlled, as he guided Sigrid's small fingers around the carving knife. And when Solveig laughed at something he said, his smile was genuine and full of a tenderness that seemed to come from some deep well of paternal love. How could the same man be capable of both such gentleness and such cruelty? How could hands that had once split a child's skull now show such patience in teaching other children to create rather than destroy? As she set the water bucket aside and joined her makeshift family by the fire, Astrid found herself facing the most difficult realization yet, that people could be simultaneously guilty and innocent, monstrous and loving, worthy of both justice and mercy. The uneasy peace that followed Astrid's confrontation with the villagers lasted barely a week before it was shattered by a discovery that changed everything she thought she understood about the twins' past. It began when Solveig fell ill, with a fever that left her delirious and calling out names in her, sleep names that made Astrid's blood run cold. "Mama Ingrid," the child whispered through chattering teeth. "Papa Gunnar. Don't let the bad men hurt baby Kari." Astrid recognized those names. They had appeared on her father's list of victims, part of a fishing settlement called Gull Haven that had been raided in the final wave of Erik's campaign of terror. According to his records, that settlement had been completely destroyed, with no survivors. When Sigrid saw her sister's distress, she began crying and speaking of details that no 8-year-old should have known: the smell of burning houses, the sound of men laughing as they killed livestock, the way the water had turned red where bodies floated in the harbor. As Astrid held both girls while they relived their trauma, a terrible realization dawned. These children weren't just random orphans she had rescued from a recent raid. They were survivors of her father's crimes, the living witnesses to his final atrocity. Somehow, they had escaped the massacre that killed their family and had spent years hiding, growing up in the shadows of coastal caves and abandoned settlements, until the day her warband had found them defending their long-dead parents' remains. "Tell me about before," Astrid said gently, when Solveig's fever broke and both girls were coherent enough to speak. "Tell me about your first home, before the bad men came." The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its simplicity. They had lived in a small fishing village with their parents and baby sister Kari. Their father, Gunnar, had been known for his generosity, their mother Ingrid for her skill at weaving nets that never failed. The village had paid tribute to Ironhold for protection, trusting that their children would be safe under Erik's rule. "The chief, who was supposed to protect us, came instead to kill us," Sigrid said with the matter-of-fact tone that children used to describe incomprehensible adult cruelties. "We hid in the root cellar, like Mama told us, but we could hear everything." "Everything?" Astrid asked, though she dreaded the answer. The man with the silver axe, Solveig whispered. He had yellow hair like yours. He killed baby Kari because she wouldn't stop crying. Said he was tired of listening to it. The description fit Erik perfectly. The ceremonial axe, the yellow hair that had run in their family for generations, the cold practicality that would see a crying infant as merely an annoyance to be silenced. Astrid felt something break inside her chest as she realized that these children she had grown to love, these innocents she was trying to protect, were the orphans of her own father's making. The twins had somehow survived in that root cellar until the raiders left, then had spent years as wandering scavengers, too traumatized to trust any adults until their desperation finally overcame their fear. When Astrid's warband had found them, they had been defending the bones of parents who had been dead for nearly a decade. You never told anyone who you really were, Astrid said, understanding now why they had seemed so resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Adults don't believe children about important things, Sigrid explained with devastating logic. And the ones who do believe might be the same kind of people who hurt us before. That night, after the twins had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Astrid sat with Erik by the fire and wrestled with whether to confront him with this revelation. His lucid moments were becoming rarer, but when they occurred, his remorse seemed genuine. Would forcing him to face the specific faces of his victims help anyone, or would it merely add to the suffering he had already caused? I've been having dreams, Erik said suddenly, his voice clearer than it had been in days. About children I hurt. Their faces follow me everywhere now. Astrid looked at him sharply. What children? There was a baby, he whispered, his hands shaking as they gripped the blanket around his shoulders. She wouldn't stop crying during the raid, and I thought it would be quicker to, he broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Do you remember the baby's name? Erik's eyes filled with tears. Kari. Her name was Kari, and she had dark hair like her mother, and I killed her because I was tired of the noise she made while I was trying to count silver. The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Erik remembered. Somewhere beneath the confusion and failing memory, he carried the specific details of his crimes, including the murder of the twins' infant sister. There were other children too, he continued, his voice barely audible. 2 girls who hid so well we never found them. I used to hope they had died quickly, from cold or hunger, so they wouldn't have to carry the memory of what I did to their family. Astrid felt her throat close. They didn't die, father. They survived. They grew up alone and afraid, scavenging for food and hiding from every adult they met, because they learned that adults couldn't be trusted to protect children. Erik's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on her with sudden intensity. What are you saying? I'm saying that Sigrid and Solveig aren't random orphans. They're the daughters of Gunnar and Ingrid of Gullhaven. They're the children who hid in the root cellar while you destroyed their world. The color drained from Erik's face as he turned to look toward the sleeping alcove, where the twins lay curled together under thick furs. Those little girls? Their oh merciful gods, what have I done? You gave them a chance to be children again, Astrid said quietly. You've been gentle with them, patient, kind. They trust you because you've shown them a different kind of adult than the ones who hurt them. But I'm the one who hurt them first. I'm the one who... Erik buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with grief that seemed to come from his very soul. Yes, Astrid said simply, you are, and now you have a choice about what to do with that knowledge. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the soft breathing of 2 children who had survived the worst kind of betrayal and somehow found the courage to trust again. They don't know, Erik finally said. It wasn't a question. They know that the man with the yellow hair and silver axe killed their family. They don't know that man was you, or that you're the chief who failed to protect them. Astrid met his eyes directly. What they know is that you've taught them to carve wood, that you tell them stories, that you make them feel safe. Erik was quiet for so long that Astrid thought he had drifted back into confusion. When he spoke again, his voice was steady with a resolve she hadn't heard from him in years. "Then I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure they continue to feel safe. It won't bring back their parents or their baby sister, but maybe it's something." As Astrid helped her father to bed that night, she found herself thinking about the strange mathematics of redemption. Could years of gentle kindness balance against moments of terrible cruelty? Could the love he showed these children somehow honor the memory of the children he had killed? She didn't have answers, but watching Erik tuck an extra fur around the twins before retiring to his own chamber, she began to believe that the questions themselves might be more important than any resolution. The discovery that would shatter everything Astrid thought she knew came from the most unlikely source, a loose floorboard that Solveig noticed while playing with her carved animals near the great hearth. The girl's sharp eyes had spotted a gap where the wood didn't quite meet, and her natural curiosity led her to pry at it until it lifted. "There's something hidden under here," she called to Astrid, who was mending Erik's winter cloak by the window. What Solveig had found was a small space beneath the floorboards, carefully lined with oiled leather to protect its contents from moisture. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in silk that Astrid recognized as one of her mother's finest headscarves, the deep blue one with silver threads that Thora had worn for important ceremonies. With trembling hands, Astrid unwrapped the bundle to reveal a collection of items that made no sense. A journal written in her mother's careful script, several letters in different hands, and most shocking of all, a crude map drawn on bark that showed pathways through the mountain passes north of the village. The journal's first entry was dated just 3 days before her mother's supposed death, and the words written there changed everything. "Erik grows more dangerous with each passing day. The raids have consumed him completely, and now he speaks of expanding beyond the coastal settlements. Today I learned he plans to attack the inland, farming communities that have sheltered refugees from his earlier massacres. I can no longer pretend this madness will end on its own. I have made contact with the resistance network that has been forming among the surviving settlements. They call themselves the Shield of Innocence, and they are led by a remarkable woman named Ingrid the Truthkeeper. Tomorrow night I will attempt to join them in the mountain settlements where they have been gathering survivors and planning a response to Erik's crimes. If I am discovered, I pray that Astrid will one day find this record and understand that I chose to fight rather than flee. Some evils cannot be survived through silence." Astrid's hands shook as she turned the pages, discovering entry after entry that revealed her mother as not a victim, but as an active resistance fighter who had spent her final weeks secretly coordinating with other settlements to bring Erik's reign of terror to an end. "My husband has become a stranger wearing a familiar face. The man I married was capable of great violence in defense of his people, but this creature kills for pleasure and profit. When I confronted him about the Ravenshallow massacre, he threatened to have me executed for treason if I interfered with his necessary work. I have been gathering evidence of his crimes, witness testimonies, records of his planning sessions, maps showing the locations of his hidden treasure hoards. Ingrid believes this information could be used to convince the High King to strip Erik of his authority and bring him to justice through proper clan law rather than through vigilante violence. But time grows short. Erik has become suspicious of my movements, and I fear he may move against me before I can escape to join the resistance." The final entry was dated the night before Thora's disappearance. "Erik knows. Somehow, he has discovered my connection to the resistance network. This morning, he showed me the head of Olaf the Swift, one of my contacts among the coastal refugees. He said it was a warning about what happens to traitors who forget their loyalties. I cannot stay here any longer, but I also cannot leave without completing my mission. Tonight, I will attempt to deliver the evidence to Ingrid's people and then continue north to the hidden valley where they have been sheltering survivors. If I succeed, I will send word to Astrid through the resistance network. If I fail, if Erik catches me before I can escape, I pray she will find this record and know that I died fighting rather than cowering. Whatever happens, I want my daughter to know that some fights are worth dying for, and that love sometimes means choosing strangers' children over your own safety." Below the final journal entry were several letters in different hands, messages from resistance fighters thanking Thora for her intelligence, about Erik's planned raids, reports from scouts about safe routes through the mountains, and most remarkably, a letter dated 6 months after her supposed death. The letter was signed Thora, Erik's wife, and addressed to someone called the Mountain Wolf. It described conditions in what she called the Hidden Valley, mentioned her work helping traumatized survivors recover from their experiences, and included a cryptic reference to waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. "She didn't die," Astrid whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. "Who didn't die?" Sigrid asked, looking up from her game with concern. Astrid realized she had spoken aloud and forced herself to smile reassuringly. "Just reading old stories, little one. Nothing important." But as she continued reading through the hidden documents, the implications became staggering. Her mother hadn't been murdered by Erik. She had escaped to join a resistance movement and had been living in secret for 20 years, working to help other survivors of her husband's crimes. The blood-stained cloak Erik had burned, as evidence of her death, had apparently been a deliberate deception, designed to throw him off her trail while she established a new life among the people she had helped save. At the bottom of the bundle was a map showing the location of the Hidden Valley, along with details